Here we go. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Bad End Podcast, episode 102. We are live on YouTube, and we are going up on the stream right now. So if you're a Bad End Game Club member through Patreon, you are catching us live right now. So hello to all the viewers. If you're not watching this live, you either missed us posting a link in our Discord, or you're listening to it as a normal podcast, which is also totally fine. Thank you for listening to Bad End. I'm joined today, as always, by my co-host, Joshua Calixto.
Hey, Kyle.
Say hi, Josh.
This is Kyle Cookstell, by the way. He always forgets to introduce himself.
I forget to introduce myself. I think it's because my name is too staccato to like really have a nice intro. I need some different walkout music for my name.
Yeah.
Today, we do have a guest with us, which I'm very, very, very excited to announce and introduce. We are joined today by Nicole He.
Hello, Nicole. Hello.
Great to have you.
Thanks. I'm
interested. I don't know. We're just gonna get right into it. I think that can you introduce yourself, because Bad End typically is a video games podcast, so often our guests are in and around sort of the general sphere of games, and you are, but your Venn diagram is slightly askew of that. So I'd love if you can introduce yourself to tell people who might not know about you or your like body of work, what you do and who you are.
Yeah, sure. So I am Nicole. I think in and around video games is a good way to describe my life, though I would say it's moving, for better or worse, more towards the center of video games from the outside. Abstract way to describe it. But okay, so basically I'm a game developer and a creative technologist. I guess those are the words I use these days. It's like it changes over time. I'm based in Brooklyn. Basically, I sort of come from more of a creative technology background, I would say, basically doing weird stuff with computers that has a lot of overlap with games, but I think it's sort of like doing weird, interactive, sometimes fun, not always fun stuff with computers that doesn't serve a practical purpose, but isn't about making games. Maybe that's one way to describe creative technology. But
seem to have lost Nicole.
We've lost Nicole right in mid-intro. I wonder if her Discord got closed.
Yeah, we'll give it a sec.
Bear with us, everybody. Yeah. Well, if she's outside of the Discord, we have to re-invite her. I'll send her another invite.
Oh, yeah, we have our Discord set to auto kick. So she's like, they kicked me out of the Discord.
Yeah. I think I can DM her. Oh, I can't DM her because we're not friends. You're seeing it live, everybody. This is how it happens.
That's how the sausage is made. Indeed, she's like, I got kicked out of the Discord. What the heck? It's for the viewer. It's for the Discord joinees' benefit. We promise.
All right, she's back. She's back.
I don't know. It was weird. I just got like kicked out. I just got kicked out of the Discord.
You're like, that's enough introduction. Boop.
It's like, well, and the last time I did something like this actually was for the Kill Screen podcast, and my internet completely cut out in the middle of it as well.
Just like, no.
I'm just cursed, I guess, to not be I'm not meant to go on.
I think podcasts. The computer, it was getting mad at you because you were saying you do stuff with computers that is not normally meant, and they were like, well, we'll show you what.
I'm always talking shit about computers, so I guess I deserve it. But
that's gonna bite you in the ass. You got to be careful. When you rise up, they're gonna be on the shit list.
You're right, definitely.
you were mid explaining basically what you do. You're a creative technologist, and you described that part of your work as a creative technologist was specifically, or I guess what you could describe creative technology as generally, is making computers do things they're not necessarily meant to do. And who gets to decide what they're meant to do is a whole other topic. But then also you're a game developer.
Yeah.
So how does that sort of intersect with the creative technology aspect?
Yeah, so the game developer thing is something that happened a bit over time. But these days I am a full-time game developer, though the my sort of body of work na is more in the creative technology realm, but that's because I've been working on a couple games for like the last couple of years that aren't quite ready to be talked about publicly yet. But it's quite interesting the sort of the, you know, where creative technology and video games, I would say indie games in particular, meet because, you know, one thing when you're making work in creative technology, a lot of times you're making sort of like interactive experiences where,
Or
you know, you want
advertisements,
people, right, which are often advertisements.
ads? Yeah.
Because, well, so, okay, so the first thing is there's a difference between the business models of the sort of the creative tech world and the indie game world, right? So in games, we sort of understand what that business model is. Games are typically products for the most part that are sold, and people make money from, you know, people buying the games that they make. Um, and, you know, there's good things and bad things about trying to make creative, like good, interesting art that is sold as a product, right? When you're making video games. But the thing that's sort of different about doing creative technology is that the funding model for that is oftentimes you're making big advertisements for companies that will pay you to do like a really cool interactive thing for their brand or something like that. Um, and so I think people usually working in creative tech often, I think there's probably more stability because you are doing work that is funded by big corporations, and oftentimes you have like a full-time job doing that kind of thing, and you're making interactions or experiences or sometimes even games, but typically they are, you know, funded by companies that, you know, want to have want you to make a cool experience for like a marketing purpose. Um, and so there's also, you know, there's like a difference between just making an interactive experience and making a game. And I think it's just like for the player or the user, just calling something a game makes people willing to invest time and even money into the experience. Like even if it's something that you make that can be described as either one, something about calling it a game just changes the way people interact with it. And so for me, coming from creative technology, I was sort of craving a deeper kind of interaction from people that would experience my work, I guess. You know, I've in the past been lucky to have made things and then sort of like tweet about them, and then it goes around and people are like, "Oh my God, that's cool." But that's sort of like the extent of it. And
Yeah.
so I was really interested in making interactive creative work, but that would get people not just get people to engage with it on a deeper level, but to like ask them to. Um, and so that's a big reason why I decided to explicitly make video games. And so that's what I've been doing, like mostly doing for the last 2 years.
So
Do you
for
think? Oh, go ahead.
I want to ask something first, because just for our listeners who maybe are not familiar with what you kind of did in the video game, in your pre-video game specific work, do you want to talk about maybe like some of your projects? I mean,
Yeah, sure.
yeah, I've looked at most of
Yeah,
them.
I'm going to my own website because I don't remember what I've done. But so I guess as a bit of a background, I went to college. I studied journalism, actually, completely unrelated to what I do now. And after that, I got a job at Kickstarter, and I was doing outreach and community management. And it was from there where I actually was exposed to a lot of the creative communities that really inspired me later on. And also, in that era, there were a lot of indie games on Kickstarter, and so I met a lot of people in that community long before I started doing this stuff. And then after that, I decided to go to grad school, like a specific program at NYU called ITP, which is a difficult to describe sort of creative technology. It's an art program, but you learn a lot of the technical skills to just make kind of whatever you want. And my first week there, I like fell in love with coding, and I knew I wanted to do that like for the rest of my life in some way or another. And so I started making projects with code, and there was sort of a theme that emerged, I think, from a lot of the work that I did was like a lot. I like to sort of use technology to make like art about technology. So I've made, one of my earliest projects, and I made this in school, was called the True Love Tinder robot. So this is a robot that it was a physical like box with this sort of disgusting human hand coming out of it, and you would put your phone in front of it, and then you would like put your own hands onto these sensors on the box, and the robot would read your feelings as you were looking at people on Tinder on your phone, and then it would literally swipe left or right for you depending on whether it thought you were into that person based on your biometric information in the moment. Um, and so, yeah, so that was a project I did. And then, I've also, after grad school, I got a job at the Google Creative Lab where I started doing a lot of work specifically focused on voice technology. So any kind of like talking to or being talked to by computers kind of stuff became my specialty. So I started doing a lot of work trying to use the technology that we typically associate with things like obviously Siri or Alexa and stuff like that, but trying to make creative things with that, trying to do games, like trying to do weird stuff, which is a very difficult thing because the technology is actually very corporate and sort of built for like customer service chatbot kind of things. But I did a few projects around that. I became particularly interested in voice technology for creative purposes. I actually now teach a class at ITP about that. I made a game, and this is probably one of the first games that I made that's a game. It's called Enhanced Computer, which is also its URL, and basically it's this cyberpunk game that is inspired by the sci-fi or like police show trope where people are like looking at a picture on a screen and they're like enhance, zoom in, and then it just like does that somehow. So this is a game that sort of it lets you do that. It's kind of
Kyle, have you
silly
played
and
this?
Yeah.
yeah.
I played
Sorry.
it and I was just like yelling at my computer for like 10 minutes.
Yeah, that's what it is basically. I mean, and so for me, I the thing that I think is interesting about Enhanced on Computer is that it is, I mean, it's real because I'm in the sense that like I'm using real technology, and that's always important to me in any of in these works that are sometimes semi-speculative in some ways. But it's always important to me to be like using actual real technology. So Enhanced on Computer uses real speech recognition, but you can see the ways in which it doesn't work that well. And the fact that it doesn't work that well is sort of built into the gameplay as well. Um, yeah, so I've done, again, looking at my own website, like what did I even do? So I've done a few projects that were using voice. I did a fun project uh, for Vogue magazine with Billie Eilish, where basically we did an interview. We had a robot interview her. And this was using like GPT-2, basically like text generating, like generating questions to ask Billie Eilish and also generating Billie Eilish lyrics that she responded to or like she reacted to. And we didn't end up using this, but like I did also build a bot that called Billie. Eilish that could have like she could have actually talked back and forth with, but there wasn't time in the shoot to do it. Anyway, so that was sort of my pre-game life, but things that are again, you can sort of like see an overlap of the like playfulness and interactive stuff with games specifically. But then and I left Google and have been working on my own games for a couple years now.
I want to ask you a question that we can cut if we need to.
Okay.
Are you working on the Kanye game?
No.
Okay, because you're the person you collaborate with often on these Google Creative projects. I heard it through the grapevine that the company that they may or may not be associated with may or may not be making the Kanye game.
Wait, who
But
are
that
you
was
talking
like
about?
7 years ago. Aaron, I think I heard at one point that Encyclopedia Picture was
Aaron.
like Hilly.
Oh, Iran. Hillary. I mean,
Iran.
I don't know anything about that. I did not even know there was a Kanye game. So I
You know about
literally
the
don't know anything.
Kanye game?
No.
Oh man, Kanye like 7 years ago was like, I'm making a video game. And there was a trailer because he showed it when
What?
like
Hold on,
yeah,
I need to
like
look
the
this
life
up.
of Pablo, like his
Was it
last
like Donna's
big
Adventure thing or whatever?
something like that. And then like he was like on stage and he was like, I'm making a video game. That shit is hard. And I was like, yeah,
Yeah, man, he's right. He said a
it's
lot of
real
things that
hard.
were incorrect factually, but
Yeah.
that
I've been
that
standing
one.
Kanye in the past 7 years has not been a thing that I try to do anymore.
Yeah.
However, at that point, I was like, yeah, man, make a fucking video game.
Yeah,
Um,
man, it is hard. Okay, like I'm used
it's so
to
hard.
so like this all these projects that I've talked about like are things that took me weeks, sometimes couple months, you know? But making fucking video games, like it just I mean, yeah, it's years. Like it's not even year, it's years and it's also like it's something I'm not used to. But it's something I
Yeah.
wanted to do, right? I've sort of like wanted to have a level of ambition a bit more, so with like much bigger projects with a lot of collaborators. But then it's just like working on this for years.
Is it
And yeah.
are the projects you're working on sort of like would you describe them as like projects that you are doing? Are you working with some other entity with them making a game, or are you like the lead creative force, or like what is your
Yeah.
relationship to the
Okay,
stuff you're making
so
now?
yeah, so I'm making two games right now. So one I can say a little bit more about. Well, okay, so one is a highly experimental arts funded game, and the other is a commercial game. So, and in both cases, I am like directing.
Gotcha.
And so the experimental arts funded one is a project I'm doing. It's a game I'm making that is produced by the National Film Board of Canada, and which is just wild, living in the States and like
Yeah.
realizing that other countries have like funding for like experimental games and stuff,
And not
non-commercial
just
games.
one, right? More than one. You can like
Yeah,
they fund like the industry.
yeah, and it's like because it's like, oh, we have the NEA or whatever here, but it's like it's like the Met gets money from the NEA.
Yeah.
It's a different. Anyway, so I mean, I'm really excited about it. We're actually going to have something public about that relatively soon, but it's a sci-fi narrative game that you play by talking. So this is a voice-controlled
Mm.
game, but it's like on a scale a little different from the stuff I've done before because it's a full narrative game. And so that is, yeah, basically directing that, working with a team of people, which is really awesome, and then working with the NFB, and they've been amazing as producers. Also, just to have the resources for the first time for me to like basically make something that is my project, but isn't like I don't have to essentially code all of it or like or do really shitty like visuals or something because I can't do visuals. Like we actually have people doing all that stuff, which is really cool. So that's my non-commercial game, and then the commercial game can't say anything about it right now, but though I would love to. But yeah, I'm also co-directing that game. We've been working on that for a while, and things are happening. But
Uh,
but it's been an interesting process, sort of working on both of these games that are very like super different in every way, but also really interesting working on a commercial game versus a non-commercial game because you're trying to make good shit in either way. And it is kind of different, you know, when we were working on the experimental game, like that, the priorities of that, of the Canadian government in funding that is like they want to make good art, right? So like
Yeah.
that's our sort of priorities. Of course, we want it to be like cool and fun also, but actually that sort of like takes a backseat to like good art, like interesting project that makes people feel things like that. And then the commercial game is going to be a commercial indie game, and it's like we want, of course, we want people to like feel things and want it to be good art, but more in the forefront, we're like, is this fun? Is this like exciting? You know, so it's like it's kind of different, but in the end, the creative process is not actually that different.
What is like the stuff that you're sort of looking at around, not to say like give us your mood board, right? But I think that there's a way where you say experimental game and then you say commercial game, and there's like a lot of, I would even describe it as baggage on like both sides of that. Like when you
Yeah.
say experimental, like some people would consider like Celeste experimental, or but you could go as far as like Oikospiel, and then you could have commercial could mean like again like Celeste, or you could go, you know, Last of Us. Like what do you sort of like as someone who's especially was in creative technology, and I would feel like I would describe it as started to transition to more specifically games.
Yeah.
Like what's sort of the stuff that you're thinking about and looking at when you're doing this? Um, and yeah, and like, and I guess you can talk a little bit about like what if that came from creative technology and is inspired by that, or you know, other stuff in that area.
Yeah, so yeah, it's interesting because like those words are basically meaningless.
Yeah.
But so our game, the game with the NFB, I mean, I call it experimental, but actually, and it's not commercial. Like it's gonna be free to play. Like that's sort of the,
Mhm.
which has its own baggage as well, which is like really interesting. Like it's going to be um, free to play on the web. And what's really unusual about it is that it's going to be I mean, it's a game that has like real funding. It has like a, you know, a decent indie game like funding behind it, but it's in a medium that for games that usually don't have that. Like it's like, you know, it's going to be free to play on the web, and I feel like normally when we think of a game like that, it's like you think of pure garbage, right? Like you
Yeah.
don't have these sort of associations.
Or like
Like it's
flash games or something.
right, right, or flash games or something. Um, I think, but you know, a game that I played recently, that I think really was a really good sort of inspiration for what we're trying to achieve with that game, even though they're not similar in any ways. But Before Your Eyes,
Mm-hmm.
did you play that?
I think Josh
I
played
did.
that.
Yeah. I was
Okay,
actually going to
yeah.
ask about that when I heard what you were saying with that game.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I played that and I loved it. It was really great. There were things about that game that made me feel really like hopeful about our game because I mean, though that game is a commercial game, like you pay money to play that game and ours won't be, but it was a similar game where sort of the unusual mechanic blinking, like play by blinking, I think sort of drew people in, right? You're like, this is really weird, like I'll try it kind of thing for that reason. But then actually it ended up being a very like emotional, really, you know, a game that a lot of people really connected with on a level that actually was, I mean, it was like the unique mechanic was relevant, but it wasn't just like a gimmick for the game.
Right, right, right.
And another thing that was really interesting to me was the length of that game because it was short, like it was like an hour
Mm-hmm.
and a half, and that's what about what we're going for too. And you know, and so like that game in particular, I think is like the kind of thing is like a similar type of thing that we're trying to do with that one, with the NFB project. I need to have these like code words for my two games because I'm always like that one or in that one.
Yeah, yeah,
Like,
yeah.
Space game.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, space game, and the other one's not space game. Um, so, but it's experimental in that it uses you talk, you play it by talking. There is a history of games like that, but they're all um, bad in a lot of ways. And I'm sure ours will be too in similar ways. But
I mean, the real
And
question is
yeah,
like if you're gonna make a some modern version of like there was a I feel like especially like female coded physical games in like the 90s with like calling your boyfriend and stuff where you would have these like physical devices that use like really rudimentary voice technology. I feel like you're just like two steps from making the next cool like interspatial telephone that you can like buy at Target and you can like call other people or something and it's like procedurally generates the narrative as you like call numbers on a phone.
yeah, that's, I mean, I actually don't know what you're referring to, so I'd love to see whatever you're talking about from the 90s. That sounds really cool. But yeah, there's something really interesting about, I mean, the reason I'm really interested in voice technology is that, as far as like all the sort of newer tech interfaces, as far as those things go, voice is so personal and it's so human, I guess. We can't
Right.
help but when we hear a computer voice, we can't help but imagine its body, like imagine like who it is. And also when you're talking, it's really difficult to sort of control what you say compared to say like what you type, right? Or if you're clicking multiple choice questions or something like that. There's something more from yourself about that interaction. And so that stuff is interesting to me in the context of making a video game. Um, so like tying it back to themes of the projects that I've made in the past, I think like sort of getting at your earlier question, there's the transition from creative tech to games. A lot of it actually I think is about exploring a lot of the themes that I've been trying to explore in my work, um, but taking it to a different, like to a more narrative
Mm,
place, I guess.
mm-hmm.
Because it's like, oh, this project is about like this and that, but like, and it's the same, and it's going to be a lot of the same kinds of things, I guess, when we're talking about the games that I'm making, but it's like wrapped in a story. It's wrapped in like sort of fiction, right? Because I guess the kinds of games that I'm making are like narrative or have a story kind of thing. And that's different, I think, from the sort of creative tech projects
I have
I've
a
done.
question that kind of goes into both of these things, I think. But when we're talking about your, I guess, your work as a creative technologist, a lot of that stuff is this in this kind of like conceptual space of what technology could be like or what it could do for us in the future. And it's interesting because there seems to be like a pretty thin line between that and like a quote video game. And it seems to be almost like drawn by this weird kind of productization of it and how it's packaged in a way. Um, and I guess what I want to ask is one of the things that I feel like you've done really well is making that the concept feel like it's overlapping with the art where with like the Tinder robot it was like yeah it's I don't know how you're doing this necessarily like I don't know what the code like or what the technology itself is doing but like that it's not taking a fully accurate like how you feel and translating that into whether you would actually swipe on this person and that I like it also I don't know how you did the Billie Eilish interview robot either but there's parts of that that just felt more this was like I saw this in a lot of comments on that video which is that it felt more like quote human than an interview with a person would be but you seem to have like a really great knack for finding that space between what the actual technology is doing and what the actual like promise of this technology is. And I'm curious about two things. A, how do you fill in that space between what the technology does and what your kind of like vision for what it should do is? And then B, how are you trying to bring that over into your work on video games?
Yeah, those are great questions. Thank you. Um, so for both of those projects, and I would say almost all of my work, um, what I'm always really interested in with new technology is that when we think about sort of new futuristic technology, we sort of imagine that idealized theoretical future version of self-driving cars working perfectly and just the kind of voice technology that you have in Star Trek or whatever that's like perfect, understands you perfectly every time. And I think a lot of times when people are making stuff around that technology or making work about it, it's like about that hypothetical version in the future. But I think what I'm interested in, and I think what makes it feel real, is that I'm using the real current technology, which sort of does the work for me, I think, on like a thematic level. Just in the like the Tinder robot is using um real technology in the sense that it was using a galvanic skin response, which is
Mhm.
I mean, it is bullshit, but it is basic. But it was measuring something from your body. Basically, it's like what they do is for lie detector tests. They measure like how sweaty your hands get and how that changes.
Right.
And so that's what the technology that we were using for the Tinder robot um, was. So it wasn't like, oh, just random. It's like pretending to be real. But of course, that technology itself is flawed and imperfect. And and the same similarly with the Billie Eilish thing, it comes up with these questions that feel surprising, like sort of nonsensical, but also meaningful. And I think what it is sort of in both those instances, it gets you to fill in the blanks with your imagination and find meaning in it. Like you like I when I showed the Tinder robot at demos and stuff like that, um it was always funny watching people like do it and then it would like swipe right or whatever, and then they were like, "Oh my God, what what does it mean that it swiped right on that person? Like maybe am I attracted to that person?" Like,
Mm.
there's like it was like funny because it was just like it made the person ask themselves the question, like sort of that trust in the technology, I guess, like made them uh yeah, I don't know, find sort of meaning in it. And I think it's the same thing with the Billie Eilish thing too, where it would ask these kind of absurd questions, but she would take them very seriously, um, and answer the questions very thoughtfully. And there's just something about like using technology in that way, the current like broken state of the technology that just makes it more authentic. I don't know. Rather than just like imagining this fake future perfect version of the tech, it's like there's something about the brokenness of it that allows us to put ourselves into it. And so your second question of how that ties into my games. So the space game, it's a little bit more literal because I am still using that technology in that game. Um, and so all those things where you're actually using the tech will still be there like thematically for that game. But for my other game, the indie game, that's going to be a normal video game, probably. But I think there's still sort of themes about like relationships to technology, relationships to each other, um, and media and stuff like that, that are just like, that are going to come through in that game, but from a different angle, I guess, without like the literal technology part of it,
Right,
but
right, right.
from the other parts of like however you think about themes or ideas when you're playing normal video games.
That was one thing with Before Your Eyes, where it was like, it. First of all, it's nuts to me that they managed to do that idea for like 2 hours or 3 hours or however long that game was. But also just that at times it definitely felt a little broken, like where I was
Yeah.
like, I didn't close my eyes, or like, do my eyes have a weird thing where they looked closed when I'm not closing them? But also it contributes to the whole like, you're very conscious of the state of your face and how you are. It makes you think about like your act your own. Oh my god, I'm doing such a bad job of talking. It makes you do like a lot of thinking about your observations and the way that you're observing the scene that's in front of you, and you're very conscious of these weird things that you would never be keeping track of in any other situation, like what your eye, like how wide open your eyes are. If there was a scene that you really want to look at, your eyes are like super far open. And they even have these sequences that are like clearly very important, and I forgot what it is that they do, but they do, it has this weird art change where it's like, okay, we're going to show you something really important, and you just, it's kind of like a boss fight where it's like, keep your eyes open for 15
Yeah.
seconds. And I'm just like,
I will just quickly say I felt like an absolute genius for realizing this. But I realized, I mean, having played with a bit of like the facial recognition technology, like I realized you can hack that game by going like this, and it won't detect a blink. Like, so I played most of the game like this, like peeking through, because it was just so physically painful.
wow.
Feels like your eyes just start like turning red, and you're like start watering. And you're like,
Yeah, it was
Literally, they're playing this sequence, and if you like fail it, it starts it over. I think this is how some of these sequences work. I had my fingers like this, my eyes were watering.
yeah.
It should come with some kind of like eye health warning.
Oh, I mean, for those just listening to the podcast, I was basically, you can hack before your eyes by placing your hand over your eyes in the webcam, and it won't detect a blink. So there's my
there's a
hot
hack,
tip
yeah.
for hacking for your eyes.
Tips. Bad end tips segment.
I just like I sanded away about half my eyelids, so they were more transparent. So jokes on them.
Yeah, you could do that
Figured
too.
it out. Yeah. I mean, something you talked about too, that was sort of like both like believing more in the computer, as well as like, I think like even in the Billie Eilish thing, I saw it a little bit, at least in how she reacted to it. There's like a little bit of a almost like infantilization of like, oh, the computer is so cute or something, that I think puts it in this
Yeah.
space where it feels more approachable. But at the same time, like the leaps that you'll go to assume that the computer is intelligent are also really big.
Yeah,
So
totally.
I was thinking about this recently with Netflix, I think, is doing this like AI generated comedy show.
Mm.
So they say, and it's like trained on hours of comedy or whatever. And they like animate it in this sort of shitty style. And part of me is like, is it AI? Because also, like, I mean, I imagine the Billie Eilish thing, I actually don't know. I'm interested to know, like, you probably generated like 150 questions, and then you chose the ones that
Yeah.
were like the right thing. So there is still like, the algorithm only can get you so far, and there is still a gap that has to be crossed where you're still screening the output. But
Totally.
you say like it's an AI generated thing, and the whole sort of tone shifts. Obviously, the set design of that piece with these like giant, like old school looking computers behind her gives it this sort of feeling. But at the same time, the tech is both, yeah, it is strong enough to almost do this. But then you still, some degree, right, exist in that middle space that Josh was talking about, where there is still a curation process. So even in the Netflix thing, I'm like, oh, like maybe this AI routine is generated somewhat, but like someone is still cutting it, putting it together, figuring out what jokes fit where, choosing the ones that like work. So it's not fully a computer, but you say AI generated, and like that middle person, like you specifically, get cut out. They're like, oh, it's just a computer
Yeah.
doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really funny because it's like, I mean, this isn't a secret, I guess, but not necessarily everyone knows this, but basically any kind of AI work, especially generative stuff, I mean, it's just, AI is just another computer program written by people.
Yeah.
And specifically with the Billie Eilish one, or literally anything that you see that's like AI generated, blah, 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 like creative thing, like it required both human input, collecting the data to put into it selectively probably, and then also the human like curation of the output, and then whatever creative things. I mean, I don't know about this show, but if it involved people actually having to animate something, I mean, obviously that's
Yeah.
that's like people did that, like all this stuff. It is really interesting that it's creative work done by humans, like anything else, but it is interesting that it's sort of like there's sort of a romanticism or like this like sexiness of attributing that work to a computer, or there's
Mhm.
something that's just charming about things that come out of a computer. Um, and but one thing, so for this the sci-fi game, it's we are using AI for that game because it's voice controlled. You play by talking, and it's in a way that it's like conversational. Um, and most of the challenge of that actually is not in having the most wildly advanced sort of like natural language understanding technology,
Mhm.
which we are using that, but like the secret sauce is in really the conversation design, the game design, the writing, which are obviously done by people. Um, it's about sort of using technology, like using some pretty advanced technology, but then also just using really well, like really clever game design
Mhm.
to make you feel like you have an experience. And so, I mean, any kind of thing like this relies on a person's both like curation or design around how the work is ultimately presented in the end. And I think, I don't know, I'm like, do most people know that? Most people, I
I
mean, I'm
think
sure
people
your
don't.
audience knows that, but like, um,
I think
I don't
people don't
know.
know that. I think it's like it's very easy. I was thinking about this too when you were describing some of what your work does, or where it exists, and specifically how I feel like I don't know when you were at ITP, but I feel like ITP always exists at this space before the commoditization of what's hot at ITP at a
Mhm.
given moment. So like you get all these like people who are really primed to make really cool stuff with the things that will be very popular in like 5 years.
Yeah,
So it's like this weird sort of like tide that's always rising, and you've sort of like taken that as a thing and then sort of extended it where there's all these things that I think are like not so well distributed yet that they're easily known. Like you are still like getting access to like GPT-2 or GPT-3 or whatever is like sort of a non-trivial exercise. Well, now actually I don't know, but like for a while, right, it was like not a
yeah,
thing that just anybody could do. And then also like training ML models like before runway is like very
yeah,
difficult as well. So it's not something that I think is easily accessible. And I think that the leap to then learn those things like I don't think anybody's trying to learn like PyTorch just to understand what's going on with this stuff. So I think that you're in this interesting space where like you work in like technical mysticism that
mhm,
in like 10 years will be like, oh, this was just what was happening. But because it's still just out of the frame, it can feel like magic and can feel sort of generative in that like really interesting way where you can be right the first, as far as I know it, like large scale game that's fully using voice activation to like use a narrative with like a natural language processing model inside of it. In 5 years, I feel like there will be other things that are like that because the technology will be around and like you can just
right.
download it as an app. You can like download the model to the Unity asset as a Unity asset or something, and like it's fine. So I think that like right now there's a and also right, it's like the way these things happen are all different right now. Everyone sort of has to slightly build their own pipeline. So I think the idea of it being evident is not so obvious as it might be now. Whereas like the hand thing, right? Like the spinning the hand, it's like, oh, it's like that's weird 5 years ago until you get uh like iPhone like styluses that also work with the sort of the same. It's like, oh, it's a haptic response. Cool. Everyone gets that
Right.
that thing acts like a finger. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of why it's been so interesting and challenging doing creative stuff with voice technology because the tools aren't built for it, so you really have to go
Right.
out of your way like to make it work for you to do creative stuff with it. But it's true that I think once it's like if it's made available in Unity or something like that in a way that is consistent or works well like that or and less expensive, like that will change things. But I guess like one thing I've really learned through the process of working on that game in particular again is like, okay, yeah, we're using the technology and stuff, but like the challenge is not the technology. The challenge is like
Right.
building, like designing with that technology and around that technology, if that makes
Well, it's so
sense.
easy to hide in that technology, right? You can say that I
Yeah,
did a voice activated game and you're like, cool. And then you get the same response that you're trying to avoid, right?
right.
Which is the, huh, cool. Like you read the
Yeah,
write up in like
exactly.
Fast
Exactly.
Company and you're like, huh, cool.
Yeah,
And you like, you move on. And like everybody can do that. Everyone can leverage the technology, but providing like a meaningful engagement with that over a sustained
right.
period of time is like, oh, that's
And
game
yeah,
design.
it's
Or like,
hard, and that's why it takes so fucking long. I'm just like,
Yeah.
God.
so like when the
Especially when
AI
there's not like a
is,
rubric, right? You're like
Yeah,
making it up as you go along and like
yeah.
failing. You're the first person to fail in all these different ways, which
Hmm.
is like great for everybody else, but makes everything for you 10 times harder.
Yeah,
or like when the AI is like racist and everyone's just like, it's a robot, dude. It's like, if
yeah,
Come
someone
on.
like, if like a black person made that robot, it wouldn't have done the racist thing to black people, probably. You know what I'm saying? Um, it's yeah. There's this. I think that for me, we're at this point where I wrote like this article in 2012 about like pop superstardom and like how digital personalities, specifically Hatsune Miku and like a bunch of other Vocaloids, were like the future of pop stardom. But like it's one of those things where I was making this argument, but I wasn't 100% sure how much I believe that would be the case. But now it's like you got like VTubers,
hmm
you got like all these models that, as Kyle brought up on a previous episode, uh, what is it, Little Michaela?
Oh, it's
Uh,
like virtual
yeah,
influencers or whatever.
virtual influencers that are getting like these huge deals with designers and stuff. And I was talking to my little brother and he was like, "Oh, do you watch any VTubers?" And I was like, "No, I don't." But it's like I had the weird, this is just like me being now, I guess, a boomer, but I was just like, that's an interesting question to ask. Like he was so straight up about it. And I was just like, no, no, is that like a thing that people actually, I thought it was like a meme or something, but he was like, no, he's like, I have a bunch of friends who watch VTubers. I have some friends who are making VTubers. Um, and, but it's just nuts. But I, the thing that you kind of brought up, Nicole, is that like, it's all made by people. And I feel like that's something that a lot of people just haven't gotten through their heads to a large extent. And it goes beyond the whole virtual pop artist thing and any art that uses artificial intelligence or like things that are ostensibly not made by people. Like I saw that argument a lot when it comes to like pop music that's written by people who don't perform it. And it's like, oh yeah, they don't write their own music. It's like, it's not good. But it's like, why, since when is why is it bad that these people in a pop group are singing the song and dancing the song, but they didn't write it? Like the people who are in movies didn't write the script usually, but you're not like pissed off at them because somebody else wrote the script. Like this is all these things are things that are created by multiple people that have different aspects, some of which are totally pulled from thin air. Like a lot of like fiction is a genre that exists. Like it's quote not real, but it's made by people and we treat it as such.
yeah,
Um, and I just feel like the whole robots slash AI part of that conversation, now it's almost starting to feel like it's just another part of that same conversation. Where I think in the future people will just accept if the performer themselves is not a human being.
yeah. That's so super interesting. I think, um, I mean, I think a thing that everyone's been talking about a lot, I think, especially over the last year and a half, is about, parasocial relationships.
Mhm.
And I think people's desire to be fans of people and things and characters, I guess, in particular. It doesn't have to be a real person. But I think there's something like I get the appeal of like VTubers or these sort of kind of characters that are sort of a person, sort of not a person kind of thing, where it's and everyone knows it's a performance, but especially when it's on something, when it's from like Twitch or YouTube or something, and people are just having sort of natural conversations, people can feel a real sense of connection to somebody when they're just like chatting and shooting the shit or whatever. But also I think there is the desire for that characterization of a person as well, and maybe a sense of mystery too. And so I think the VTuber thing is like appealing for that reason. And similarly, like our feelings about AI and computers and like computers as characters, like something I'm always super interested in. Um, I think it has to do with like a desire to, I don't know, like to connect and know and be a fan, but also like there's something like the thing that's really interesting about like a computer as a character is like that thing where in some ways you do treat it like a baby because it doesn't know that much, right? Like any kind of like AI ML thing, it's like it makes these like silly mistakes and it's kind of cute, but also there's a sense that it knows everything too at the same time.
Hmm.
It's a really kind of strange thing that I think a lot of people feel in both directions about computers, and especially like computers that are anthropomorphized, basically, like turned into characters. Um,
It's also like it also puts distance between the person who's making the art and the person who's consuming it. Like that's another thing about parasocial relationships is that the internet has really shown how toxic that can be when you're just
yeah,
like
yeah,
your face is on shit and you just have like millions of people say like just trashing you at the same time, and just being able to kind of put a little bit of a buffer space between
right,
you and that person while also still sharing very personal ideas, um,
yeah,
because it is still you that's creating these things. Like your your personality is definitely in the Billie Eilish robot
yeah.
question asker interviewer, um, but it's not the kind of thing where it's like people are pissed at you if the robot asks a weird question, um,
Yeah.
because there is that
How do you,
buffer space.
I think getting sort of what Josh is talking about, like how do you feel about like bodies and presence in the relationship to technology generally? Like obviously you're interested in like the voice and touch and sort of sound and stuff. How do you think about that relationship? And like a small sidebar of that, especially looking at your work, it doesn't and like thinking about like parasocial relationships, there's a way where I don't like read you as someone who's interested in like biohacking and like total like symbiotic existence between person and computer and that they're the same. It seems like you still there's still a distance that you have where you're not so interested in saying like let the person become the computer necessarily, but it's saying like let the computer exist. And I'm interested sort of like your relation, how you think about the concept of the body in light of that like dichotomy, I guess you could say.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think, I mean, yeah, you're right. I'm not a kind of, yeah, but like biohacker kind of person or really interested in sort of like fusing the human to the computer or something like that. I think what I'm, what I like the core of what I'm interested in is like our feelings about computers and
Mm,
about ourselves. And I think that we don't think of computers or using computers even in a sort of physical way, right? Even though we type and stuff like that, to use a computer, we swipe on the phone and things like that. But it feels more like something that's, I don't know, not related to using your body when you're using a computer. But
mhm,
the voice part is interesting because that is feel like something about our own physicality um, has an impact on that relationship with the computer. Um, and yeah, I think it's interesting like thinking about like a body because once you give a computer a body too, it's like changes how people think
Hmm.
about it. Like when that the most famous robot or whatever, Sophia the robot, who's like intentionally designed to trigger that uncanny valley feeling. It's super interesting because I think it like that for actually, that is a difference between us and computers, right? It's that we are bodies. We have bodies and computers are just code. Um, and I think it's like I'm just interested in like how we feel about that stuff, how that feeling changes over time, like the ways that we use the computers to connect with each other, but then also, you know, like you read about those apps, those like generative text apps that people talk to. Like there's also the I mean, very relevant thing is the Anthony Bourdain controversy,
Hmm.
right? From recently. It's like who owns his voice, right? Like who is that person that's speaking in the film? Is it him? Is it some it's like a like simulacrum of Anthony Bourdain? Is that ethical? And I think that actually is really tied to the idea of a body, right? Like
Hmm.
his body did not exist in that moment, but like in the creation of that audio. It's really weird. Um,
But also, because in that specific example, right, it was like animating words that he had written or
right.
something. So it's not even like it wasn't even generative in the sense that it was like new Anthony Bourdain whatever. It was like specifically his words that were written.
Right.
So even more so than other things, do have an attachment to the person that's now passed. Yeah.
I all this talk is making me think of how much it's got to suck to be like a creative technologist in general, just because like you more than I feel like any other person who's doing creative work and art, you have to think so much about the ethical ramifications of like, oh, I just think it would be cool if Anthony Bourdain's voice read this fucking passage that he wrote.
Yeah.
Like if you're an artist, you could just be like, I just thought it'd be cool to do a painting of Anthony Bourdain's face, and it's like, oh, people, oh, it's so beautiful. Yeah, I just made this from my heart, man. But then if you're dealing with anything that's like tech related, there's so many other things that you have to think about. And I was thinking, like, man, this is so like we usually don't with our guests on this podcast, I feel like everything is like just so laid back, even when it's kind of like an interviewee type thing, and we're getting like heady with it. I hope we're not making her feel like we're just picking her brain about like these big
Oh
ideas
no.
and shit.
Yeah.
But it's like I feel like if you're working in that space, you have to be thinking about that shit all the time because it's you when people are dealing with this stuff, it might be stuff they've never seen before. It might like mess with their brain in a way that they're not used to having their brain messed with. And you have to think about that stuff just because technology has that relationship with people in society where you're showing people oftentimes things that they've never seen before. They don't know how it works. And there's just so much more there to it. So it's like, I that's one thing that's kind of nice about video games is that we exist in kind of this, I don't want to say side space, but it's like, Activision could just make fucking Kratos. They can just add to fucking Greek mythology. They can just add to
Activision's a really
any.
interesting pull right now, Josh.
Oh, any video game company can make. They can just fuck with ancient tradition, and people are just like, all right, whatever.
Or like at least like 16-year-olds are like whatever, and luckily 16-year-olds their like parents buy them stuff, so it doesn't matter as
Yeah,
much.
and then like
But
name
'cause I feel like
searching the people who say otherwise.
yeah.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Like, I mean, it's true. I mean, that is true. But it's also true that you get when you're doing creative technology work, it's like you also get to have the medium to like to explore these ideas, right?
Hmm.
Like about because it's like because these are the ideas that are that or and the technologies that are very top of mind for everybody that have a big impact on like, the future. And so it's cool to like get to use the medium again to comment on the medium or explore it. Um, but it's funny to me, like another thing, just thinking in my process of thinking of creative tech versus games, um, what you're saying just now is sort of like talking about, we're sort of talking about how the creative tech medium gives you opportunities to like do art or explore serious topics or whatever. Whereas like games are sort of just like frivolous, whatever. But actually, part of the appeal for me of going from creative tech to games was that games, I mean, for all the truly horrific and awful things about the games industry and community, there's actually a culture of criticism, creative criticism. I mean, people say probably not enough, but like there is a culture of creative criticism for games, say indie games. Like let's just talk about indie games, right? Like there are award ceremonies, like there are reviews, there are like
Hmm.
there are ways in which people actually do talk about the work in like serious, like it, thinking about it and critiquing it as art. And you don't actually have that in creative tech. Like it because again, most of the work that actually has funding is an advertisement.
Hmm.
Or it's something maybe like, or there could be a couple examples of more almost fine art versions of creative technology, like a couple people have things that are shown in galleries, right? But for the most part, most of the things that are creative tech are don't like because of the fact that there are ads essentially, or because yeah, for I don't know, there's no culture around it in the community. Like there isn't that level of criticism. um I mean not criticism just like saying bad stuff about it, but just like thinking deeply about it, engaging with it at like the ideas, writing what you think. Like there's this strong culture of that around games, and we don't have that for creative tech. And so actually that was part of the appeal, a big part of the appeal for me to make games is because I wanted that. Like I wanted people to just, even though I basically got the start of my career, my creative tech career of like people seeing my stuff on Twitter and being like, oh, cool, retweet. Like, as much as that's nice,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
wanted more. I wanted deeper something. And I'm sure I will regret it saying this or like regret asking for this once I just get like bombed for whatever it is. But
It's a
like,
review
you
bomb.
know,
No, it's
there is something, yeah, it's different.
it's interesting because like we are very much on the critical side of things in the video game space. Like that's
Yeah.
where we've always existed. Like most of the people that we have on the show are critics. And I think when you spend such a long time doing video game criticism, you see kind of like the best and worst that it has to offer. And often the median is just like you just start thinking about it in a certain way, not always in the most positive light. But the fact that it does exist is significant in and of itself because when I when I think about creative tech, it is something where I do kind of see it presented not without comment, but you'll hear someone say like, "Oh, it explores the relationship between this and this," and that's kind of like what you hear about it, and then the rest is just how you react to the art, or the technology, and there's not really much else of a conversation being had outside of that. Whereas with Before Your Eyes, like there was a bunch of great essays about how people were interfacing with that game and what it meant to them, and making really cool observations about what it was saying. Whereas a few years ago, that might have been creative tech in and of itself, and I mean you might argue that it is, even though it is a game. I think that one kind of is on the line, but it is part of that conversation. I guess it's one that I take for granted, or am maybe a little bit too cynical toward.
Hmm.
Maybe question mark.
No, I
Wait,
mean,
I want.
obviously people are always, people like games, like gamers can't take criticism of their games that they have this like fan relationship with and stuff like that. Like there's lots of problems, of course, but we don't but there isn't anything like that in creative tech because everyone's
Yeah.
making ads
Or
for
but you
Mercedes
get
Benz.
like self-congratulatory stuff in creative tech where it's like you show at IO, you like go to Ars Electronica and everyone's like, nice like golf clap. And then you like go away and make the same installation again the next year for like the other big company. And so there's like everyone stay like unlike games, everyone in creative tech often stays like very like busy and like have like paid work, which
Right.
is
The
not the
money is
reality for
certainly more
everyone.
stable. Yeah.
Your money is like stable. You like go, you like make your big ad for your company, and like the same group of like 80 to 100 people in New York like go to all these companies and do all this stuff. But there's not like a no one wants to step on anybody's toes, even as much as you can say that, because as soon as you make a comment, it's like, oh well, it's an ad, so like I didn't have control over it, these things. And like even in the gallery situation, right? It's like it's so small that no one wants to like pollute the pool with like bad vibes or whatever. So no one really wants to be a critic in the way that this
Right.
stuff could be criticized. And even like some of the stuff like before your eyes, right? You see the same thing when things like that show at like film festivals for like VR type things where there's not a lot of actual criticism around those pieces because the space can still feel so small and like everyone just knows each other. So like who's really critiquing who? Games have the benefit, right? And actually, I'm talking about this because we got a comment on the Discord from Chirpish asking, can they speak to why a video game critic is needed? And like specifically, I think that the nice part about games critics specifically is that it is an external um, group of people who are interested in the domain, but themselves not practitioners. So I think that there are people that it's nice to have a group of people who can look at something and sort of levy critique against it out of often, if not always, effectively good faith, like argumentation or understanding of what something is, to then hopefully inspire that. I do think that the critical pathway between critique and like and developer internalization is maybe not where it needs to be. Whereas I think for something like art, I think it's maybe a little bit closer. But I think like games critics, I think is needed in this way because it does allow like a more sort of fertile understanding of the possibility and someone to kind of like somewhat disaffectedly like check people and be like, hey, like no, or like yes, this is really cool, or like stuff can be raised or lowered. Um, I don't know where I was going, but yeah, I think is the role. Like, I think it is nice that critics exist in games, whereas like you were mentioning, there's like a sort of, uh, what's the word? I want to say deft is not the word. A dearth. There's like a dearth of critique around the space
Yeah.
of creative tech.
And it's like as a creator, I just reached a point where I wanted to make stuff that, I mean, as I've said, I wanted people to engage with on a deeper level. So that's both getting critique, but also like literally just getting like people playing your game and like
Yeah.
there's nothing so immersive as a video game. Like people are just willing to completely immerse in a game that you make, which is so different from like anything else, when you make something an interactive experience or whatever, like people still they aren't gonna like put themselves in it and then fully commit to like being inside the experience. And there's like ideas that I want to express and blah blah, all that shit. But like I just want a deeper connection to people through the work, and it's hard to come up with something that is like, you know, probably like a book or a movie, right? Is like
Mm-hmm.
the level of type of engagement, but gamers are like more passionate, let's say. Um, but yeah, and you just don't have that in creative tech. So it's not just getting critique from writers, which I also want, or from people that can look at it in the context of everything, things that are going on and stuff like that. Um, but also just for like normal people to like engage with the work and hopefully enjoy it and think about ideas and blah blah blah, like all that stuff.
It's
Yeah.
nice to have an audience.
I
Yeah.
Going back to the question from the Discord and kind of trying to get together with this, I do feel like the idea of criticism has really broken down in the past like 10 years, not in the sense that like there's not a unified vision of what criticism is, but in to the opposite side, I think, which is that I feel like there's this very specific view of what criticism of video games is today that is just really off base, in my opinion, where it's like people think it's just like it's either you are talking about the game as a product and like whether it plays well, and just having the like, does the A button work to jump well enough, and is the aiming good enough. There's that, and like, you know, is it a 7 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 thing. And then there's the other side, which is like the quote bad criticism, which is like what I would say most of the people that we know do, where it's more like based on their own personal experience and how they feel about a game, and whether, and it's usually more focused around like identity and whether it like resonates with this one person who has this specific life experience, and whether they whether that bothered them instead of like the quality of the jumping or what have you. But there's like so many different vectors from which people could talk about video games and review video games that are not those things, that I almost feel like people kind of forget that are ways that you could talk about games that are just also still fun, ways to talk about games and valuable in and of themselves. And I feel like once we start accepting that stuff as criticism again, things will get better, or so I hope. Because again, like Nicole, what you're saying about like wanting to be involved with like the critical space, like anyone who plays a game on Steam, who like writes a 3-word review, is doing criticism too. Like anyone who plays the game and has something to say about it is a critic in and of themselves, even, you know, even if they don't have something interesting to say. But there's so many different angles that you could approach this from, and I feel like we tend to forget that, and we shouldn't.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Also, like the stuff you said about like identity is interesting too. Um, yeah, I guess it does feel like a lot of games writing or stuff or things about developers or about people like a lot of so focused on someone's identity. And like I mean, you can probably tell by looking at my work, like I'm not interested in making work about me, like about my
Mhm.
identity. And it kind of um like it feels like I feel like especially women or like not a white man or whatever, you're like encouraged to, or like that's the kind of stuff where people are really interested in having you speak on panels about your identity and stuff like that. But for me, like that's not what my work is about. Um, and it's, yeah, it's just interesting to, like, I would love to just have the opportunity to be a creator making stuff where my identity, of course, my identity absolutely informs my work and everything I make, but it's not like about that. And,
It's like
you know,
it's not like the only defining thing about what you do. Whereas like if
right,
you were a white dude,
right,
nobody would be reducing it to that
right,
as like a knee jerk thing.
Well, it's like I
right.
was thinking, especially considering like the work that you do with like the relationship between humans and computers. I was sort of like in my mind, like comparing, contrasting you with a lot of the work that like Holly Herndon does. Like I don't know if you've seen like the thing that she did recently with like Holly Plus.
Yeah,
She
yeah,
basically trained a whole AI model on like, or an ML model on like her voice, I think
yeah,
specifically, such
yeah,
that anybody can effectively generate like Holly Herndon music.
right.
I think there's like multiple stems of music. So you can effectively generate new Holly Herndon esque music. And then she wrapped it up in this like like DAO, like decentralized autonomous organizations. So then and it's basically like she's effectively licensing herself, but
Mhm.
her whole I don't know, her like personal data almost about like making new stuff, and then she makes her money off of it if it does well, but also people do have a license to use it. And like her work, and this is not to say either mode is better or worse, right? But I think that like your relationship to technology and this sort of like gap that Josh mentioned, where it's like this like air gap, and then where the tech is happening, and what Holly is doing, where it's like sort of one and the same, where she's been playing with similar things, right? She made this, one of her albums had like this almost like Vocaloid-esque uh, creature or person that she trained to sing, and now that's like she is the sort of work itself while also being the tech, etc. And I feel like I think what you're saying, I mean, as a white man, I do feel like I see that often as well, where like women often get asked about their like representation and identity and the stuff that they're making, whereas like I'm making a video game right now and I expect literally zero questions about my identity and my like, how did your background inform like
Right.
this game about space alien fighting?
Yeah.
It's like no one's gonna ask me that, but like you do it, and that's the first thing. It's like, well, where'd you grow up? Because I can see
Right.
some of this stuff coming into this thing. It's like, fuck off,
Yeah.
like it's not just make something.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, first of all, like I love people's work. Like I love when people make work about themselves and make
Yeah,
stuff that's
yeah,
autobiographical. Like I think it's great. And some of my favorite games and works are from that angle. It's just like not what I do, but
right.
it's definitely like when you're a woman in particular making creative stuff, especially when you're making tech stuff, like technical stuff, I think there is a sort of I don't know. It's just like I think I just was thinking about the stuff when you were talking about identity, because like there's so much discourse around identities, like or like, oh, that game looks cool because you get to play as like a black woman, or it's like stuff like that on this like level where it's it's
I mean, to
complicated
be
because
fair, games really need that. Like,
no, yeah,
we do need that.
absolutely, no, totally, yeah.
We were having this conversation like a couple weeks ago, which is that video games are so shitty about identity that it's hard to exist on the side where you personally are not like 100% focused on it in your work or in your even in your critique, where it's like you don't want to say that it almost feels like you're making yourself look bad if you say that your work is not fundamentally centered around like your identity as a blank,
Yeah.
especially if you are marginalized or you're not like a white dude. And that's just like a shitty thing about the video game conversation and a lot of other conversational realms in culture in general right now. But I would say especially in video games, just because like Gamergate wasn't even 10 years ago, et cetera, et cetera. It's like you don't want to be construed as like having any part of your body on that side of the line. So you have to be like very careful when treading in any other part of the space. So it is like a frustration that we have here, and one that you can hear people like start talking about it in a different way, where they're just like, I'm not saying that it's blah 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 blah, but yeah, bottom line, representation is important and
Yes.
identity is important, but some people's work is not fundamentally focused on that. Some people have different interests that they want to explore, and they should have the space to do that as well, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think it's just you see a lot of this is really complicated, too long and complicated for this but it's just like I think a lot of times you see autobiographical work done by, you know, marginalized people, and and I think because it feels like that's one way that you get attention, or it's like people like are interested in that, want to promote that kind of stuff. And so it makes sense to talk about that stuff. And yeah, I guess I just, as you said, it just shouldn't be like that's the only kind of thing that you can make, right? I feel like it's such a cringy thing. I feel like sometimes when you see, big game conferences, for example, and then they have like, oh, we had our like marginalized developer group here, like that we invited, like check them out, and then it's a picture of all these people, and it's just sort of like
Yeah.
it's complicated. It's like, yes, you should bring those people in, like you should have those people, you should like support and highlight their work and stuff, but it's just like then it has to be labeled in this way, and then of course it's just like people are like, oh, you're just here because of that. Like
It has like, yeah, that's one part of it too, is that like other people will start projecting that shit onto you, where it's like, dude, I'm just doing my thing. And then I think the thing is that it has this really flattening effect, right? Which is, people will say something that is like a fundamentally okay statement, like everything is political, or they'll say something that's like everything is based, your identity is in everything that you do. And it's like, I totally agree with those statements, but if I make a video game about, that's like a political commentary about capitalism, it's gonna be like, I'm gonna be dealing with different proportions of identity and different proportions of politics in that work than I would if I was making Super Mario Brothers. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Not that Super Mario Brothers isn't in some way political or involving someone's identity. Not that it's completely irrelevant to talk about those things, but when you reduce someone who is working on something to their identity, it says more about that. It feels like you're trying to have the conversation on the grounds that you want to have the conversation, as opposed to meeting the creator where they are trying to build this thing, which I think you can have both of those at the same time, where they acknowledge that their identity plays a role in what they make, and that what they make is political, while also saying like, those were not the primary ideas that I was trying to explore with this work. Like, we can talk about that, but also like, it would be nice if other people asked me about different facets of this work as well. You know what I'm saying? And it just feels like it sucks, because I do think that if you're a woman of color, if you're a person of color, or what have you, you just don't get to have that conversation as much, because other people want to have the conversation on different grounds that, while not irrelevant, might be like less relevant to what you care about or what you're trying to do, which usually it's like pretty easy to see that on the surface, right? Like,
Yeah.
I can kind of tell looking at your work that your primary priority isn't to like talk about who you are as a person.
Yeah. And it's also another thing that's tricky is just like, of course, being a person, blah, blah, like being not a white man or whatever. I'm sure there have been, there have been, of course, bad experiences that I've had. And I'm sure types of like discrimination that I didn't even know about and stuff like that. But I also know that like my identity, even though it's sort of irrelevant in my work, I think has given me more opportunities, probably. Like if I were a white guy, I probably would have gotten less attention sometimes, I think, for some of these things. And it's a weird thing that's like you can't really measure it, and it's just a guess, but you can tell, right? It's like, and it's yeah, I don't know, it's a tricky thing. Or just like that feels weird too, but I'll take it, I guess. Like,
Yeah, it's like it is weird to like exist in that space where I also am wondering like, what opportunities have I gotten that like another counterpart of mine might not have gotten. But I feel like definitely part of that is this weird like imposter syndrome type thing, definitely, because your shit's good, first of all, like coming from bad end, but
Thank you.
yeah, very high level, very high
We'll
consecration.
send you a little PNG you can put on your website.
Okay, good, great. Like the laurels.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that's like partially imposter syndrome type shit almost, where it's like always something that you have to think about, which also sucks. Like, why do I have to think about this shit, man? I just want to make stuff. But yeah, it is something that's like, I know for me is at the back of my mind, and I'm sure it's like that for a lot of people who get recognized for their work, and also for being a marginalized person who's like successful in the space. But yeah, I don't know. All this conversation is really difficult to have, but I think it's important because we don't usually get perspective about this stuff because it is so hard to tiptoe around. You know what I'm saying? We are getting a bit deep into the episode. I feel like we should talk about video games for like 3 minutes and then wrap up. So I could talk about the video games I've been playing. Have you been playing anything interesting that you want to like talk about here real quick that maybe I should check out if I haven't yet?
So I started streaming during the pandemic, like everyone else did, for fun and for social interaction, I guess. And I enjoy it. Like I've loved that I like have started streaming because I play a lot of games that I wouldn't play normally. I like to play sort of like more weird indie games, or some like kind of bad old Japanese games, like stuff like that. And because like when I like to sort of sit down and play video games, I like to play, I mean, I like big open world exploration type of games, stuff like that. But there isn't like one that I'm currently playing. But if I'm like, when people ask me what games I'm playing, like the real answer to that is that I play Michael Brow games. Is that how you say his name? On my phone, like
Bro.
Yeah.
Michael Bro games on my phone, like literally constantly. Like I actually had to delete them today because I was just like, I just play, it's not like I'm if I'm being honest, those are the games I play the most. Like just purely from the time that I spend playing them, just phone. Like people don't talk about the games they play on their phones.
Like
I've cycled through, I had a big Imbroglio phase, but recently I've been playing Cinco Paus.
Oh yeah.
Like constantly. They're just the perfect, like they're the perfect.
They're great phone games.
They're just so perfect, like such perfect phone games that like let you like dissociate like from the world. Like it uses enough of your brain to like achieve that, but not enough of your brain that you can't like that you have to focus on it. You know what I mean? And so, like honestly, that's really what I play like the most.
That's a good answer though. Like of all the games that you could have said you were playing, that's a good one. That's a good one to pick.
It's just just being honest. I mean, I feel like people should talk about more what they play on their phones because that's the real shit.
And while you shit, that's the thing that you're doing.
Kyle brings this up every time we talk about mobile gaming.
What? While you play while you poop?
Yes.
I don't listen. When else are you
gonna
play?
We don't have to go any deeper.
I mean, with the Steam Deck, there's so many opportunities
everywhere. I want to ask you about the other game that you've been playing that you recently streamed, the yogurt game. Can you talk about this insane yogurt game?
Yeah. Okay. So I saw Bennett tweet about this game called Yogurt Commercial 3. And before you ask, there is not a yogurt commercial 1 or 2, which already just gives you the sense of what this game is going to be like. And it was incredible. Like, so it's, I don't really know anything about the person who made it or anything, but it has a really classic, you play it on PC, but it has this classic, like, Flash game vibe, like purely Flash game vibe. And ostensibly, the goal is to make yogurt commercials. Like, that's what you're supposed to do in the game. But it's, like, utterly absurd. Like, I mean, 30 minutes in, you're, like, eating a vampire torso. so that you can go meet the anti-mayor on the moon and like crawl through a dungeon in hell. Like it's just anyway, it's really good. I really recommend it. It's called Yoga Commercial 3. And yeah, it was great. It's really great.
There's a
Is it
clip
like one of these
off-
games that's secretly by like a famous indie developer, or is it like truly outsider?
I
Out
don't
of
know.
nowhere.
Well, the person ended up DMing me because I got stuck. Because no one was like
They
streaming
DM'd
it,
you.
and
They're like, hey.
yeah, well, this has happened this has happened so many times as I stream a lot of like small indie games, is that actually the developers show up. Um, so I have to be careful about what I say. But yeah, they DM'd me and they have like I don't know who they are, what their name is. I think because their Twitter name was like yogurt guy or something, and I'm like, I have no idea like who this person is or anything about them. Um, but it's unique. It's a unique experience. And it just has such a personality, and I feel like you just get that even just from the name itself and from the premise. Like it's really good.
You
should
gotta
play
we
it.
gotta link the clip of you.
Oh,
There's like a clip of you talking about like what you have to do to get
yeah.
to the next part of the game, and it's like
Yeah.
2 minutes, and it looks like the Pepe Sylvia meme, like as a human being speaking, with Charlie
Yeah.
Day in front of the whiteboard. It's
So
literally
yeah,
a video
it's like
version
that.
of that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
I had a clip. We'll
I'll dig
paste a
that
clip
out.
on the Twitter. I think we're ready to wrap.
Let's wrap it up.
We're wrapping. Okay. This is Bad End Podcast. Thank you so much for listening and for joining us in our video version, in our chat and whatnot. Want to thank our guest, Nicole. Nicole, thank you so much for coming. Do you want to plug anything? We talk mostly about how you can't really talk about this stuff, but anything that people should look out for, where they can find you on the internet?
Yeah. So my website is nicole.pizza. My Twitter is Nicole He. And my Twitch is Nicole 2_He. It's very, very bad. 1_ is taken. And yeah, thank you so much. This was super fun. Fun conversation. And thanks for having me.
Hope you enjoyed the difficult to tread around conversations and the weird heady shit at the beginning of the show. But yeah, thanks for joining us again. And thank you for joining us on the podcast and or stream. Again, we are Bad End Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at Bad End Podcast. You can email us at badendpod@gmail.com. We have a Patreon, patreon.com/badend. You can support us there to gain access to our Discord, and you can be one of our viewers to watch us live. If you are listening to us on Spotify or iTunes or what have you, you can also check us out on YouTube. Just search Bad End Podcast. You can find us. This episode will be as a video version if you want to watch us in full motion. I didn't actually bring up any video game clips this time. I usually have, Nicole, this is like usually high production value thing. Where
Multimedia experience.
Multimedia. I pull up clips like this fourth quadrant in the bottom was going to turn into like videos, games, clips of stuff.
Wow.
I should have pulled up your website. It's hard to have a conversation and like be the VJ at the same time,
Yeah, no, it's fine.
But yeah, that's mostly where you can find us. We're part of Superculture Network. Support our friends. Check out Superculture Network. We've got a bunch of friends doing stuff there too. But yeah, thank you so much for listening. And I'll cut this off now. We'll see you in a couple of weeks. Later.
Bye.
Bye.